indicated with Demerol may cause death.
The doctors killed her. That's very simple.
You took her to the hospital.
Right, in New York hospital where they massacred her.
Trailed off and I said, "Are you trying to tell me that Libby's dead?" She said yes.
The night began like any other in New York hospital. The residents, tired but focused, moved between patients as the clock ticked toward midnight. But as the hours passed, a young woman named Libby Zion, just 18 years old, would fall victim to a series of medical missteps that no one could have predicted. What should have been a routine admission quickly spiraled into a catastrophe that would leave the medical community shaken and a family forever devastated. Libby Zion entered the hospital with a high fever, some agitation, and a known history of depression. The medical staff, overworked and fatigued from long shifts, missed a critical detail, an error that would lead to a fatal reaction in her body. What was it about the decisions made that night that turned a manageable condition into a life-threatening crisis? As her condition worsened, her father, Sidney Zion, stood helplessly by, watching his daughter deteriorate. What must have been going through his mind as he saw the life slipping from her? A father desperate for answers, questioning the medical decisions being made, but receiving little reassurance. Was the pressure of long hours and fatigue on these young residents clouding their judgment? Could more involvement from the attending physician have made a difference, or was the situation already out of control? The questions Sidney had that night would ultimately lead to a nationwide reformation of how hospitals and residency programs operate, but at what personal cost to the Zion family? In this video, we'll be walking through the events of that night, from the critical decisions that went wrong to the broader changes that Libby Zion's case set in motion. Now, before we continue, I'd like to ask you a small favor. Our channel is still new, and every single subscriber helps us grow. Your support motivates us to produce even more in-depth, high-quality content like this. So if you're enjoying these deep dives into medical mishaps and want to stay updated on future videos, please consider subscribing. It's a simple action that would mean the world to us and ensures you never miss out on any new cases. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the case. Libby Zion was born in 1965 into a family of influence and intellect in New York City. Her father, Sidney Zion, was not just any journalist. He was a well-known and respected figure in the media world, known for his hard-hitting columns and work for the New York Times. Her mother, Elsa Zion, was equally well-regarded, deeply involved in New York's cultural circles, which meant that Libby was raised in an environment that was both privileged and intellectually stimulating. The Zion household was filled with conversation about law, politics, and media, providing a rich backdrop for Libby's upbringing. From a young age, Libby was described as bright and charismatic. Those who knew her remember her as a lively, outgoing individual with a sharp mind and a strong sense of independence. She exhibited a unique curiosity about the world around her, traits that reflected the intellectual environment she grew up in. She wasn't just any child of a prominent family. She was someone who, even as a young girl, displayed her own ambitions, creativity, and individuality. Despite the privilege she enjoyed, life for Libby wasn't without its challenges. As she grew into her teenage years, Libby began to struggle with mental health issues, specifically depression. Her parents, who were deeply caring and supportive, ensured that she received the best psychiatric care available at the time. Libby was prescribed phenelzine, commonly known as Nardeal, an MAOI that was used to help regulate the symptoms of her depression. While this medication did provide some relief, it came with strict dietary restrictions and dangerous interactions with other medications, something that few people fully understood back then. By 1984, Libby had transitioned into adulthood and was enrolled as a freshman at Bennington College in Vermont. Bennington, known for its focus on creativity and individuality, seemed like the perfect place for someone like Libby. an intelligent, independent thinker, eager to carve her own path. She was thriving academically, but behind her vivacious and intelligent exterior, Libby's mental health continued to be a struggle. She remained under psychiatric care and continued her treatment with phenelzine, a decision that, tragically, would play a significant role in her untimely death. Despite her ongoing mental health struggles, those close to Libby describe her as someone with a zest for life, a young woman full of potential and promise. She was known for her keen wit, her ability to engage in deep conversation, and her lively sense of humor. Libby's upbringing had molded her into someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo, a trait that she clearly inherited from her father, Sidney, whose own career was marked by a fearlessness in his writings. However, Libby's story takes a tragic turn in January 1984, after a period of adjusting to college life as she returned to New York City. Bennington College had been her home during her freshman year, but she was now participating in a work-study program that allowed her to split her time between academics and work. It was a time of transition, a common experience for college students figuring out their future paths. Yet, behind the scenes, Libby's health was becoming a growing concern. Her long-standing struggle with depression, something she had dealt with for years, was managed through medication. But by early 1984, her physical health began to deteriorate in ways no one anticipated. Libby was under the care of her family's trusted physician, Dr. Raymond Sherman, who had overseen her treatment for some time. He had prescribed phenelzine, Nardil, a powerful antidepressant that belonged to a class of drugs known as monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAOIs. For the average person, phenelzine might sound like just another medical term, but it's important to understand how this medication worked and why it would later play such a tragic role in Libby's case. MAOIs, like phenelzine, were commonly used in the 1980s to treat severe depression, but they came with strict warnings. These drugs work by altering the balance of chemicals in the brain, particularly serotonin, a neurotransmitter that influences mood, emotion, and even physical functions like body temperature and digestion. The challenge with MAOIs is that they interact with many other medications and even certain foods, making it crucial for doctors to closely monitor what other substances a patient might be exposed to. On the evening of March 4, 1984, Libby's health took a sudden and frightening turn. She developed a high fever, reaching a dangerous 103 degrees, and began exhibiting erratic behavior. Her parents, especially her father, Sidney Zion, became increasingly alarmed as Libby's condition rapidly worsened. She wasn't just running a fever. Libby was agitated, pulling at her clothes, and slipping in and out of lucidity, a clear sign that something more serious was at play than a simple viral infection. Sidney, as both a former lawyer and an experienced journalist, had a sharp understanding of how important immediate medical intervention was. Without hesitation, the Zion family rushed their daughter to New York Hospital, one of the top medical institutions in the city. They arrived around 11 p.m., with Sidney's concern growing by the minute. At this point, the medical team's assessment of Libby's symptoms led them to believe she was suffering from a viral illness. They noted her fever, tremors, and moments of severe agitation, but did not initially suspect that something more life-threatening could be at play. Here's where the story takes a critical turn. The residents and intern assigned to Libby's care that night were relatively inexperienced and overwhelmed by the demands of their shift. The decision to administer meperidine, Demerol, a narcotic painkiller, seemed like a reasonable option at the time. Meperidine was often used to relieve pain and calm agitated patients. However, the residents failed to recognize a crucial and dangerous detail. Meperidine is strictly contraindicated in patients taking MAOIs, like phenelzine. This drug combination posed the risk of triggering serotonin syndrome, a life-threatening condition. Now, serotonin syndrome is a condition that arises when there's too much serotonin in the brain. While serotonin is essential for regulating mood, body temperature, and several bodily functions, too much of it can cause the body to spiral into a state of dangerous overactivity. Hyperthermia, or a dangerously high body temperature, along with tremors, agitation, and muscle rigidity, are all hallmark symptoms of serotonin syndrome. If untreated, it can lead to cardiac arrest and death. But in 1984, serotonin syndrome was a poorly understood medical condition. The doctors treating Libby that night were unaware that the interaction between phenelzine and meperidine was triggering a catastrophic reaction in her body. Instead of recognizing this deadly combination, they assumed Libby's worsening agitation and fever were symptoms of the viral illness they had initially diagnosed. This misstep proved fatal. Even as Libby's symptoms intensified, her agitation grew more severe, and her body began reacting to the serotonin overload. Her condition was misinterpreted as a result of her presumed viral infection. The lack of awareness of serotonin syndrome, combined with the fact that her attending physician, Dr. Sherman, wasn't physically present at the hospital, led to a critical failure in her care. By treating Libby's agitation with meperidine, the residents had unknowingly worsened her condition, bringing her closer to the brink. They were facing a situation they had little experience in handling, and without the proper supervision and knowledge, they made choices that would soon turn fatal. As the night wore on, Libby Zion's condition continued to unravel, and the once manageable symptoms began to escalate into something much more severe. Her father, Sidney Zion, stayed by her side throughout the night, unable to shake the growing feeling that something was terribly wrong. His parental instincts, combined with his legal and journalistic background, pushed him to repeatedly question the medical team about their treatment plan. Why wasn't Libby improving? Why was her fever still climbing despite the medications? These were the questions he asked, but each time he felt brushed off. His concerns, much like Libby's deteriorating health, were met with silence. The doctors and residents, overworked and overwhelmed, didn't provide the level of attention that her condition demanded. This was a key failure, as night shifts in hospitals were notorious for stretching residents to their limits. Often, these young doctors were responsible for dozens of patients at a time, juggling high-stress situations with little sleep. At New York Hospital that night, the team in charge of Libby's care included a first-year resident, Dr. Louise Weinstein, and a second-year resident, Dr. Greg Stone. Both of them were under immense pressure, trying to manage multiple patients throughout the hospital. Meanwhile, Dr. Raymond Sherman, the attending physician responsible for Libby's case, wasn't present at the hospital. His absence that night left the young residents without the senior supervision they desperately needed in such a critical situation. As Libby's agitation escalated, her behavior became more erratic. She began pulling at her intravenous lines, a clear indication that her agitation was worsening. In response, Dr. Weinstein, the first-year resident in charge, decided to take action to prevent Libby from harming herself. Weinstein ordered physical restraints, a standard measure in cases where patients become physically unmanageable. But physical restraints were only a temporary solution to Libby's worsening condition. Dr. Weinstein also prescribed haloperidol, a potent sedative used to calm agitated patients. Haloperidol is commonly used in emergency settings to sedate patients who are highly agitated or showing signs of psychosis. However, the use of this drug without fully reassessing Libby's condition was another critical oversight. At this point, it's important to understand that Dr. Weinstein was not deliberately negligent, but rather stretched too thin. She did not physically reevaluate Libby after administering the sedative, as she was managing other patients in different parts of the hospital. This highlights a systemic issue within hospitals at the time. Young doctors were expected to make critical decisions while overworked and exhausted. Meanwhile, Dr. Stone, the second-year resident, had left to rest across the street. which was a common practice for residents during long shifts. Without sufficient rest, even the most experienced resident can make mistakes, and on this fateful night, the lack of oversight proved to be disastrous. Between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., Libby's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her fever, which had been hovering around 103 degrees, suddenly spiked to a terrifying 107 degrees, a level of hyperthermia that can cause irreversible damage to the body. Hyperthermia is often associated with serotonin syndrome, the condition caused by the interaction between meperidine and phenelzine. The nursing staff, recognizing the severity of Libby's condition, tried to lower her temperature using cooling measures. They applied cooling blankets, ice packs, and other methods to try and stabilize her body temperature, but by this time, her body was in crisis mode. At approximately 6 a.m., Libby Zion went into cardiac arrest. Her heart stopped, and despite the medical team's best efforts to resuscitate her, she was pronounced dead at 6:30 a.m., less than 12 hours after she had arrived at the hospital. Sydney Zion, who had been by her side throughout the ordeal, was left devastated. His vibrant, intelligent daughter, who had her whole life ahead of her, was gone. To avenge her, he embarked on a highly publicized and emotional crusade to seek justice for his daughter. Believing that her death was preventable, Sydney Zion held the hospital accountable for what he perceived as gross medical negligence. His outrage was particularly focused on the fact that inexperienced resident doctors were left to manage his daughter's case without adequate supervision from senior physicians. He believed the exhaustion of overworked medical residents also played a critical role in the fatal errors made that night. Sydney's anger was further inflamed when he learned about the combination of drugs given to Libby and the lack of awareness among the residents about the dangerous interaction between phenelzine, Nardil, and meperidine, Demerol. This interaction led to serotonin syndrome, which ultimately caused her death. Sydney Zion was vocal in his criticism, calling for accountability not only from the doctors involved, but also from the entire medical system. The media caught wind of the case quickly, as Sydney Zion's influence as a prominent journalist allowed him to amplify his grievances. He referred to his daughter's death as murder and demanded that the medical community be held responsible. Public attention grew rapidly, and the case became a national topic of discussion, shining a light on the grueling hours resident doctors were expected to work and the lack of adequate supervision in hospitals. In May 1986, Sydney's relentless efforts paid off when Manhattan District Attorney Robert Morgenthau agreed to let a grand jury consider whether the doctors should be charged with murder, a rare move for a medical malpractice case. The grand jury ultimately declined to press murder charges, but did indict the doctors for 38 counts of gross negligence and incompetence. The allegations centered around the improper administration of medication and the failure to conduct thorough diagnostic tests on Libby. The medical community was shocked by the charges, and it sparked a broader conversation about the structural issues within the healthcare system. Sydney Zion's crusade wasn't only about the specific doctors involved in Libby's care. It was about transforming the culture of medicine to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The legal proceedings dragged on for years, with the doctors maintaining that they had made an honest mistake, one that any doctor, no matter how experienced, could have made. Testimony during the trials revealed that even prominent physicians had not been aware of the drug interaction that killed Libby, highlighting the limitations of medical knowledge at the time. The case finally came to a close in 1995, when a civil trial jury found the two residents, as well as Libby Zion's primary care doctor, negligent. They were ordered to pay $375,000 to the Zion family for Libby's pain and suffering. Although the jury found negligence, they stopped short of deeming it wanton negligence, which would have implied intentional or reckless disregard for Libby's life. Instead, the case was characterized as an honest but tragic mistake, a reflection of the broader problems in the healthcare system at the time. Sidney Zion's fight did not stop with the courtroom, though. He transformed his grief into a crusade for reforming medical education and hospital practices, particularly around the long working hours and inadequate supervision of medical residents. At the core of the issue was the fact that resident physicians were often overworked, clocking in up to 36 hours of continuous shifts without adequate rest. Sidney Zion argued that this exhaustion contributed to the medical errors that caused his daughter's death. He famously wrote in a New York Times editorial that a resident working a 36-hour shift is in no condition to make any kind of judgment call, forget about life and death. Sidney's campaign caught the attention of both the public and political leaders. As media outlets picked up the story, it became a national talking point, leading to a significant push for reform. In response to the mounting pressure, Dr. David Axelrod, New York's state health commissioner at the time, formed the Bell Commission, an advisory group headed by Dr. Bertrand Bell. This commission was tasked with investigating the working conditions in hospitals, particularly focusing on the long hours residents were expected to work and their lack of supervision. The Bell Commission's findings were damning. It determined that the system in place at the time was not conducive to patient safety. The recommendations from the Bell Commission led to sweeping changes, which were codified in what is now known as the Libby-Zion Law. This law, enacted in 1989, introduced several key reforms: resident work hours. One of the most significant changes was the limitation of resident work hours. The law stipulated that residents could not work more than 80 hours a week and could not be on duty for more than 24 consecutive hours. This aimed to prevent the fatigue-related errors that were believed to have contributed to Libby Zion's death. Supervision requirements. The law also mandated that attending physicians be physically present or available at all times to supervise residents, particularly in emergency situations. This addressed the critical issue of young and inexperienced doctors being left unsupervised, which was a central factor in Libby Zion's case. Medication protocols. The case also led to greater scrutiny of hospital medication systems. At the time of Libby's death, there were no computerized systems to check for drug interactions like the one between phenelzine and meperidine. The reforms called for improved medication safety protocols, including the use of technology to reduce human error when prescribing and administering drugs. These reforms were initially implemented in New York State, but soon became the foundation for changes across the United States. In 2003, the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, ACGME, adopted similar rules for residency programs nationwide, further solidifying the legacy of the Libby Zion case in medical education and patient safety. The reforms that arose from this tragedy fundamentally altered the structure of residency programs, emphasizing patient safety and the well-being of medical professionals. However, they also sparked debates within the medical community, with some arguing that the restrictions on work hours could negatively affect the training of young doctors by reducing their exposure to complex cases. Nevertheless, the changes were a direct result of the tireless efforts of Sidney Zion to ensure that no other family would have to endure a similar tragedy. His relentless campaign for reform turned his daughter's tragic death into a catalyst for positive change in the medical system. But what do you think? Do you agree that the Libby Zion case revolutionized medical training? Or do you believe more reforms are still necessary? How do you feel about the balance between doctors' work hours and patient care? We're eager to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. If you found this video engaging, please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. And don't forget to press the bell icon so you're notified whenever we post new content. Also, if you haven't already, be sure to check out our recent video, which dives into another groundbreaking case that changed the course of medical history. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.